welcome to Anwerp Studio. In this video we will talk about painting white hollyhocks, and we will talk about the technique called negative painting, and I'll show you how important it is for painting white flowers or white anything that you want to paint, and I will give you some other useful tips for painting white with watercolor. To start my painting, I'm going to use Derwent Inktense pencils. I don't want any pencil lines to show on my white flowers, and Derwent, I'm using yellow here. It will dissolve when I start painting. These are water-soluble pencils, and it will kind of blend with my painting a lot better than a regular pencil would. If you watch my other videos, I use this technique a lot to paint people when I start sketching faces. It works really well for that subject matter as well. I will start by painting my flowers, the yellow centers and the pink areas around them, and I will also paint all those little shadows that you see on the petals. I'm working very lightly with very diluted watercolor because the flowers are white, so I want the shadows to be light and transparent. The centers can be pretty vivid because we will be adding some details and texture to them later. You will see that in the video, but the shadows on the white need to be very light and transparent. And I will paint the other two flowers. So everything looks pretty pale and kind of undefined, but when we start painting the background, you will see how these flowers will just come to life and pop off the page. Alright, now we will start working on the background. This is what we call negative painting. I'm working around my flowers. I'm leaving white of the paper alone, and I'm painting those dark green areas around the flowers. I have to be a little careful around the edges. I'm looking at my reference photo and I'm trying to replicate the edges of the white flowers. Another important thing is to work in sections because you don't want hard lines in the background just yet. So I'm working wet on wet. I'm not letting my paint dry, and I'm also varying my greens. You will see I'm using several greens from my palette, also some yellow that I'm mixing with blue that gives me a different shade of green, and that all creates interest in the background because you don't want it to be all the same and boring. So working in sections, moving around my painting, not jumping around, but just painting one section after the next. And I know that if I add cooler colors like blues and purples, that will push my leaves that I'm painting around the flowers backwards. They will recede and appear further away. That's what I want. I want the flowers to be my focal point and to pop forward, and I want the background to recede. So that's why I'm adding some blue and some purple to it. And also some cool green, because that Cascade green that I'm using, it's a pretty cool shade of green. The video is sped up, but I'm working fairly quickly because, like I said, I don't want the paint to dry. I want it to blend on the page, so I need to work wet on wet. And I also can find those leaf shapes in the background. I can leave some areas slightly lighter, and I can darken certain other areas, and that will create the illusion of those leaves that you see in the reference photo. So it's like negative painting within negative painting. Okay, while I was working on the background, my flowers dried, and now I can darken certain areas around those centers just to give them more interest. I will be using some white gouache in these areas to create texture later. You will see that in the video. So I need those areas to be fairly saturated, so when I put white on top of it, it will still be pretty bright. I'm using a small brush because it's kind of small area and I want to be as precise as possible. Painting all those tiny little shadows on the petals. They're very important. That's what gives realism to our painting, if we capture all those little shadows and describe the form as exactly as possible. And I hope in comments you will let me know if you like hollyhocks, if maybe you have them in your garden or somewhere where you live. And also let me know what is your favorite flower so I can paint it and make a video. There is the cast shadow here on the petals on the bottom, so let's paint that as well. It helps me to describe the form as well. I switched back to very transparent color because, like I said in the beginning of the video, I want those shadows on the petals be very light and transparent because the petals are white. And we need to keep in mind that watercolor lightens at least 2 shades when it dries, so kind of make adjustments in your mind for that. Okay, we're going to let this layer dry, and now we can continue building the tonal range in the background. We're going to go back to negative painting. I'm using much darker mixture and I'm using a flat brush. Flat brush holds a lot less water than a round brush, and it allows me to have a lot more saturated color that I want for my background. Because if you squint while looking at the reference photo, you will see certain areas are very dark, almost black. I don't want to use black, so I'm using very dark purple-green mixture. And I'm finding those very dark areas because that's what makes my painting come to life, and that's what makes my flowers white. It's not the white paint, it's the contrast between very light flowers and dark background. So again, I'm working around the flowers, finding those very dark areas and applying almost pure pigment with no water with a flat brush. And I'm softening the edges to have variety in certain areas, and I'm leaving them as hard edges around the flowers because that's what they are. And again, I'm finding leaf forms in the background and I'm painting around them. I'm not covering everything with the same dark tone. I'm leaving some areas lighter because light hits the leaves in some areas and they're a lot lighter than other areas where I see the ground. So I'm going to do this here on top as well. And you see the painting is getting more and more realistic because now I have the tonal range. If we look back at where we started, it was all very amorphous and you couldn't really tell what was going on. But now we can actually see that we have white flowers and dark leaves around them. We can also adjust shadows in the centers of the flowers now that we have the full tonal range established. Just a few additions. We can darken certain areas on the flowers as well. And now all we have left to do is to add a little texture and verify a few details, and our painting should be finished. To add texture, I use White Artist Gouache. This is M. Graham brand, titanium white. I'm going to dilute it here in my little ceramic cup, and I'm going to use a calligraphy pen to apply the texture. So it's a mix of white gouache with water, thin enough so I can use it in a pen. I made the reference photo a little larger, and you see those little like white veins on the petals. That's what I'm going to paint right now with a pen. They look like little tree branches, so I have to work in various directions to replicate that. And let's do them on the other two flowers. And I can also use white gouache to refine the edges a little bit. While I was working on the shadows on the petals, I lost a few white areas, a few highlights, but it's easy enough to restore them with white gouache and my brush. So just a few quick brush strokes and also a few highlights on the stem. It's a mixture of white gouache with green watercolor. Gives me nice opaque coverage. And the last thing I want to do for texture is to show pollen that we see here on the stem and in the centers of the flowers, and using a little piece of sponge. Gouache works really well. I mixed gouache with a tiny bit of lemon yellow, and I'm going to stipple it on my flowers to add texture. If you're interested in this technique, I have a whole video on painting dandelions with stippling, so check it out. I will leave you the link in the card up here and also in the description of the video. It's a fun technique and very useful for painting flowers. Alright, I'm going to put a few finishing touches on my flowers, but the painting is pretty much done. It's important not to get too carried away with the details, but I think a few places need to be darkened just a little bit in the centers to make them pop even more. I used a block of watercolor paper for this painting, so now I'm going to cut off my painting off the block. I'm finding this little spot where there's a gap in the glue, and I'm cutting this off with my palette knife, and this is the final result. White hollyhocks painted with watercolor and a little bit of white gouache using the technique of negative painting. I hope you had fun watching this video and you found some useful information in it. I hope you subscribe to my channel and come back to watch more videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time here in Anwerp Studio.